In the summer of 1973, David Bowie's therapist told him a terrifying truth. "David, you no longer exist. There's only Ziggy." This sentence marked the peak of rock and roll's most dangerous identity crisis. David had become a prisoner of the Ziggy Stardust character he'd created 18 months earlier. Even when the stage lights went down, he wouldn't remove his glitter makeup, wouldn't take off his platform boots, couldn't shake Ziggy's arrogant attitude. Fans were worshipping a rock god. But behind the curtain, David Bowie was slowly disappearing into his own mind. And on the night of July 3, 1973, in London, in front of 5,000 people, Bowie walked on stage, grabbed the microphone, and announced his most radical decision. This wasn't just the end of a concert. This was the execution of rock history's most famous character. If you want to hear this story all the way through, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button to support us. David Bowie was in a major crisis at the end of 1971. He'd made 2 albums, but neither had brought commercial success. Sitting at home thinking, the idea came to him to create a character completely different from himself. This character would be an alien rock star sent to save the world. His name would be Ziggy Stardust, and he would be much more than David's stage persona, a complete alter ego, a separate entity. In January 1972, David went to his hairstylist and got those iconic orange-red locks. Then he went to costume designer Freddie Boretti and ordered those legendary sparkly outfits, platform shoes, glitter makeup, androgynous look. These were all Ziggy's signature. But David hadn't just put on a costume. When creating Ziggy, he'd also put a piece of his own personality in there, and this would lead to big problems down the road. When the rise and fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars album dropped in June 1972, the world wasn't ready. This wasn't just a music album, it was a complete story. The story of an alien rock star who learns the world will end in 5 years. Ziggy came to Earth, gave people hope, became a superstar, and ultimately became a victim of his own ego. David didn't know it yet, but Ziggy's story was a prophecy of his own future. The first months after the album's release were magical for David. When he took the stage as Ziggy, fans went crazy. Young people, especially those questioning gender norms, found themselves in Ziggy. David Bowie had finally achieved the fame he wanted, but he was achieving it as Ziggy, not as himself, and this distinction began to blur over time. Something started to change in the fall of 1972. David's close friends and band members noticed that David was still acting like Ziggy, even when he came off stage. Mick Ronson, his guitarist, said in an interview, "At the start of the tour we were talking to David. A few months later we were talking to Ziggy. David was gone." This wasn't just a performance anymore. David was genuinely starting to become Ziggy. Even backstage, the Ziggy persona continued. David's humility had been replaced by Ziggy's arrogance. David's normal way of speaking had been replaced by Ziggy's theatrical and ego-centered talk. When friends called him David, sometimes he wouldn't respond, but when they said Ziggy, he'd turn immediately. This wasn't just method acting, this was identity loss. Angie Bowie, David's wife, was one of the first to realize the seriousness of the situation. Even at home, David no longer wanted to wear normal clothes. He was constantly in makeup, constantly in those sparkly outfits. Angie once described it this way: "When I woke up in the morning and looked next to me, I didn't see David, I saw Ziggy. The light I recognized in my husband's eyes was no longer there. There was someone else in there." Psychologically, David was entering very dangerous territory. Using an alter ego is normal for creators, but David's situation was different. Ziggy had stopped being just a stage persona and had become a separate entity in David's mind. Psychologists might call this dissociative identity, the fragmentation of personality. David, in creating Ziggy, had created a monster in his own mind. In late 1972 and early 1973, the Ziggy Stardust tour was absolute madness. A different city every night, thousands of screaming fans, constant movement. For David, this pace caused him to retreat even further into the Ziggy persona. Because David Bowie wasn't ready for this much attention, but Ziggy was. Ziggy loved this attention, fed on it, and grew stronger. Throughout the tour, band members could clearly see the change in David. Trevor Bolder, the bass player, described it in an interview. "We started rehearsing with David, but we went on tour with Ziggy. We couldn't talk to David anymore. He was Ziggy, morning, noon and night. He never took the makeup off, never changed out of the costumes. He acted like he really was from another planet." During this period, David's substance use also began to increase. Cocaine was common among rock stars of the era, and David wasn't immune, but cocaine made David's mental state even worse. Drug use began to completely erase the already blurred boundaries between David and Ziggy. At concerts, David was now completely out of control. Sometimes he lived the Ziggy character so deeply on stage that he'd forget lyrics, get confused about where he was. Once backstage after a concert, he'd passed out, and when he woke up, the first thing he said was, "Where's Ziggy?" He was talking about himself, but doing it in third person. This was a clear sign of mental dissociation. As Ziggy's popularity grew, fans' behavior became more intense and more dangerous. Young girls and boys came to concerts dressed in Ziggy costumes. Some weren't hoping to see David, they were hoping to see Ziggy. And when David realized this, he understood a frightening truth. People didn't love him, they loved Ziggy. This realization created a crisis in David's mind. In an interview, a close friend who asked not to be named described it this way: "David came to me crying one day and said, 'Nobody knows me anymore. They only see Ziggy. I'm lost.' That's when I realized this wasn't just a performance. David was really disappearing. Fans were so obsessed that some would wait outside David's house for days. They wanted to see Ziggy, talk to Ziggy, touch Ziggy. For David, this was constant pressure. Because when he wasn't Ziggy, these people were disappointed, and this pushed David further into the Ziggy role. At concerts, fans tried to hug David on stage, tried to kiss him, but they weren't shouting David, they were shouting Ziggy. For David, this was psychologically devastating. Every day he saw with his own eyes that his own identity was being completely erased and replaced by Ziggy, and he couldn't find a way to stop it. In the early months of 1973, Bowie was so worried about her husband's condition that she took David to a therapist. David initially resisted because Ziggy didn't need therapy, but Angie insisted, and eventually David agreed. In these sessions, the seriousness of David's real situation would become clear. After a few sessions with David, the therapist told him a terrifying truth. "David, you no longer exist. There's only Ziggy." This sentence had a shocking effect on David. For the first time, a professional had put into words what he'd been feeling. David had really disappeared, and Ziggy had taken control. The therapist educated David about dissociative identity disorder. He explained that this alter ego David had created had now become a separate personality and had gone beyond David's conscious control. The therapist warned, "If you don't stop this, if you can't get rid of Ziggy, there won't be a person named David Bowie. There will only be Ziggy Stardust." In these sessions, David began to talk about Ziggy in third person for the first time. He talked like, "Ziggy wants this, Ziggy does that." The therapist said this was very dangerous and that David urgently needed to separate from Ziggy. But how? Ziggy was David's career, his source of income, the foundation of his fame. Killing Ziggy could mean losing everything. The therapist offered a suggestion: kill Ziggy in front of the public, end him with a grand gesture, and that way both the fans and your own mind will experience closure. David was initially skeptical of this idea, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized this was the only way. If he didn't kill Ziggy, Ziggy would kill him. After David made the decision to kill Ziggy, he began planning how to do it. This couldn't just be an announcement. It had to be theatrical and unforgettable, because Ziggy's death had to be as big as Ziggy's life. David decided he would do it in London, at Hammersmith Odeon, at the end of a concert. But here was a critical detail. David didn't tell anyone about this decision. He didn't tell the band members, didn't tell management, didn't even fully tell Angie what he was going to do. Because if he told them, maybe they'd stop him. Maybe they'd change the plan. David had to do this on his own. He chose July 3rd, 1973. They would have a concert at Hammersmith Odeon that night, and David had decided this night would be Ziggy's last. Would the tour continue? Would there be a new album? David didn't even think about these things. He only knew one thing: Ziggy would die after this night. As he prepared for the concert, David felt a strange peace inside. Angie later described, David was different that day, like a weight had been lifted. But at the same time, he looked sad. Then I understood that David was preparing for a funeral that day. Ziggy's funeral. That day David applied his glitter makeup more carefully than ever. He put on his costume, tied his platform shoes. He looked in the mirror and saw Ziggy Stardust for the last time. And he said to himself, "This is our last night, Ziggy. Goodbye." Hammersmith Odeon was completely packed that night. 5,000 fans had come to see Ziggy Stardust. Nobody knew this night was special. Even the band members thought it was a normal concert. But David, as he walked on stage, knew this was an ending. The concert was magnificent. David performed every song as if he were singing it for the last time. He tried to make every movement, every look, every moment special. The fans were wild. The band was amazing. The energy was through the roof. But inside David was a strange sadness. He was saying goodbye to Ziggy. As the concert approached its end, David's heart was racing. Now the moment was coming. They sang the last song, and when the applause died down, David picked up his microphone. The stage went silent. 5,000 people were waiting to hear what David would say, and David said the sentence that would change rock history. "Not only is this the last show of the tour, but it's the last show that we'll ever do." This sentence was understood within seconds. Fans went into shock. Some began to cry. The band members froze. Mick Ronson looked at David and saw the shock in his eyes. It was like he was saying, "What have you done, David?" But David had killed Ziggy. Applause, screams, crying. The stage was in chaos. Fans didn't want Ziggy to go. But David was already starting to leave the stage, his glitter makeup mixed with sweat, tears streaming from his eyes. But this time, it was David Bowie crying, not Ziggy. Backstage, David was in complete panic. What had he just done? At the peak of his career, at his most popular moment, he'd ended everything. Band members rushed to him, asked questions. "What do you mean last show? Is the tour cancelled? What's happening, David?" David couldn't answer. He just sat down, put his head in his hands, and cried. This time he wasn't just crying for Ziggy. He was crying for lost time, lost identity, lost 18 months. At that moment, he realized how much of himself he'd sacrificed in creating Ziggy. When Angie came backstage and saw David like that, she didn't know what to do. She hugged him and said, "You did the right thing." For the first time in a long time, David felt like himself, but at the same time, he was in a void. Ziggy was gone, but what was left in his place? His manager came and he was angry. "We have 18 months of tour plans, David. Album sales are at their peak. Do you know what you've done?" he shouted. But David simply said, "Ziggy is finished. I had to end, or I would have." This sentence showed the seriousness of the situation. David had really killed Ziggy to save himself. That night, as David left Hammersmith Odeon, for the first time in a long time, he took off his platform shoes and put on normal shoes. He wiped off the glitter makeup, put on normal clothes. When he looked in the mirror, he saw David Bowie, and he cried. He felt both relieved and lost. The days after Ziggy's death were complete chaos for David. The press went crazy. Headlines like, "Is Bowie retiring?" "The end of Ziggy," "The end of Bowie," were everywhere. Fans were in shock. Some were angry at David, some were sad. But the real problem was in David's own mind. For 18 months he'd been Ziggy. Now Ziggy was gone, so who was David? Finding the answer to this question took months. David sat at home, didn't make music, didn't talk to anyone. He fell into depression. Because when Ziggy left, a large part of David's identity left too. In sessions with his therapist, David confessed that Ziggy had never really completely died. "He's still inside me," David said. "Sometimes I look in the mirror and I see him. Sometimes I hear his voice. Ziggy is gone, but not completely gone." This was a classic example of post-traumatic stress disorder, but over time, David began to heal. He started making new music, but this time as himself. He released the Aladdin Sane album, then Diamond Dogs. Each album was David discovering a new aspect of himself. But none were as powerful an alter ego as Ziggy, because David was now careful not to lose himself. Years later, in a 1990s interview, David said, "Killing Ziggy was the hardest and most correct decision I ever made in my life. If I hadn't killed him, I wouldn't be here today. There would only be Ziggy, and he probably would have gotten himself into serious trouble by now." The death of Ziggy Stardust affected not only David Bowie's personal life, but all of rock history. This event changed how artists used alter egos. Now everyone knew that alter egos could be dangerous, that if not controlled, they could swallow the artist. Many artists learned from David's story. When they used alter egos, they did it more carefully. They took care to separate their characters from themselves. David's experiences with Ziggy became a cautionary tale. Your creation can consume you. Ziggy's legacy also continued. That character became the symbol of the glam rock movement. Androgyny, gender fluidity, theatrical performance, these were all part of Ziggy's legacy. David killed Ziggy, but the cultural revolution Ziggy created continued. Even today, 50 years later, musicians talk about Ziggy, pay tribute to him, draw inspiration from him. Lady Gaga, Marilyn Manson, Adam Lambert, they all follow in Ziggy's footsteps, but they try not to make the mistake David made. They've learned to separate their characters from themselves. In 2016, just days before his death, David Bowie released his final album, Black Star. On this album there was a song, and some fans thought it was a reference to Ziggy. As David faced death, perhaps he thought about Ziggy again. In an interview, David said this about Ziggy: "Ziggy was my greatest achievement and my greatest mistake. He gave me fame but almost took my sanity. I love him and I hate him. He's a part of me, but he doesn't control me anymore." David's son Duncan Jones made a statement after his father's death. "My father talked about Ziggy until the end of his life. That character had taught him so much: identity, creativity, control, but most importantly, it taught him how easy it is to lose yourself." Ziggy Stardust died on the Hammersmith Odeon stage in 1973, but that character lived forever in David Bowie's mind. Every time he took the stage, every time he sang a song, Ziggy was there, like a shadow, like a whisper, like a memory. On the night of July 3, 1973, David Bowie made his bravest decision and killed Ziggy Stardust. This decision brought him down from the peak of his career, but also saved him from mental collapse. Ziggy's death was David's rebirth. This story teaches us something important. Creativity is powerful, but requires control. Artists must be careful with the characters they create, because sometimes what we create can consume us. David Bowie learned this the hard way. When we look at Ziggy Stardust today, we don't just see a rock character, we see a symbol of an identity crisis, a psychological battle, a salvation. Ziggy was both David's greatest achievement and his greatest enemy, and his death was one of the most dramatic moments in rock history. David Bowie saved himself by killing Ziggy, and in doing so, he gave us one of the most important lessons of all time. Sometimes to live, we must kill what we've created. Ziggy died, but David Bowie lived, and that was the most important thing.